this week. So I'll be opening, and then Dr. Richards will go first.
Mute myself.
So we need to mute. And then January Littlejohn, and then I'll just close it out. So a quick introduction of myself. I'm Robin Steenman. I am the chapter chair for Moms for Liberty, Williamson County. And I'm also a wife, a mom of 3, ages 2, 5, and 8. And I'm former Air Force. Tonight's presentation is part of our 2022 to 23 school year for parents. So as our kids progress through the school year, so are we as parents learning the crucial issues facing our children in schools, not only Williamson County schools, but schools across the country. And these issues are intricate and nebulous and hard to nail down. So we're trying to provide these resources to parents to help you understand what your child is up against and what you are up against as their parent. So gender ideology, things that we're hearing today that we never thought we'd hear 5 years ago, certainly not 10 years ago, but that gender is a spectrum, that it is a social construct. I Googled gender identities, how many are they? And I got 37, 64, 81, over 100, and infinite. And I got all of those in the span of about 5 minutes. So it surely is fluid, however they want to define it. And Dr. Richards is going to help us with that. There are so many names for the various genders that I cannot cram them all into this slide. But it's transgender, agender, bigender, gender fluid, genderqueer, pangender, polygender, intergender. It's like a song. And then it goes so far as people identifying as furries, frogs, and demons. And then it just gets ever more complex with the two-spirit LGBTQIA+, and even Justin Trudeau.
Let's check
Can't keep up with this one.
On the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
I will never apologize for standing up for an LGBTQ kids' rights.
I love you.
To not have to undergo conversion therapy.
So that is more on the comical side. You know, we can all kind of smirk about men getting pregnant and having abortion rights and needing access to tampons. But then there's other things going on, like changing the language to birthing people, chest feeding, bleeders. And they don't say moms or dads anymore. It's parents or caregivers. And now, in addition to pronouns, we have neopronouns.
Let's check in first.
So the previous slide had some of the things that are just a little more of the ridiculous that, you know, kind of make us roll our eyes in some cases. But as far as, you know, but this slide is deadly serious. We have men competing in women's sports, negating women, erasing women from women's sports, biological men accessing women's spaces that are supposed to be safe. Parents have become the enemy. Parents are vilified by a myriad of groups, including the schools, vilified by trans activists and called gatekeepers. Sound medicine and psychology are abandoned. Kids are mutilating themselves via surgical procedures that are entirely elective and unnecessary, and they often come to regret later on. Glitter families are replacing biological families. So it's really the destruction of the family, and that's something to take very seriously. And then if you look at the numbers, so the numbers in this country are not as well tracked as they are in the UK, but I would put a lot of money to bet that our numbers match that at least. And there's, in 10 years, their incidences of gender dysphoria in girls is at 4,400%. And teen suicide is also way up, I have heard, by a factor of 19. So it's a lot to wrap your head around. How do you wrap your head around it? How do you make sense of it? Because it is here in Williamson County. You will have to confront it because your child is confronting it at least regularly, perhaps daily in the schools. And here to help with that is Dr. Jay Richards. J.W. Richards, PhD, is director of the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Life, Religion, and Family, and the William E. Simons Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He also is a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute and executive editor of The Stream. He's author or editor of more than a dozen books, including the New York Times bestsellers, Infiltrated, Indivisible, Money, Greed, and God, winner of a 2010 Templeton Enterprise Award, and The Human Advantage. He is also creator and executive producer of several documentaries, including 3 that have appeared widely on PBS. His articles and essays have been published in the Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, Washington Post, the New York Post, Newsweek, Forbes, Fox News, National Review Online, The Hills, Investors Business Daily, Washington Times, quite a list, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Huffington Post, the Federalist, the Daily Caller, and even beyond that, many other publications. He has appeared on over 1,000 radio and television programs, including Larry King Live, CBS Evening News, MSNBC, Huckabee, Dayside, Fox and Friends, Studio B with Shepard Smith, Glenn Beck, PBS, CBN, TBN, is a regular guest on EWTN. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jay Richards. So I'm going to stop my share and let him take over and show you his slides.
Great. Thanks so much, Robin. It's good to be with you all. So I'm sorry I'm in a hotel room. I'm actually at a conference for the Discovery Institute this week out in Seattle. So this is kind of the best I can do. What I want to do, I know you've heard from Colin Wright and Chris Elston, and you'll hear from January, who has very specific personal knowledge with this issue. I actually got into this issue because I think it's an existential crisis. I think it's a serious crisis for our culture. Because it's an attack on the human person, an attack on the nature of the human person, on our basic biology. I don't think ultimately that doesn't seem like the kind of thing that should be a partisan issue, but whether you like it or not, at the moment it is a partisan issue. And what that simply means is that there's one party that is on one side of it, and there's a party that, for the most part, even if they're not talking much about it, is on the other side. And so whether we want it to be partisan or not, it is. And so the reality is we're going to have to deal with this both as a cultural and an educational issue, but also I think it's a political issue. And unfortunately, until when it comes to politicians, until they realize that supporting gender ideology gets them unelected and opposing it gets them elected, we're probably not going to see much happen in the political sphere. And so what I want to do is I want to first help you to understand what it actually is, like down at the bottom. I'm not a lawyer. I'm actually a philosopher, and so I try to distill the essence of ideas. So I hope to be able to do that in a few minutes. And then what I want to do is give a few minutes about what we think, both at the Heritage Foundation, but also a lot of organizations like Heritage, the way we think this ought to go in the States. And so the problem is gender ideology is so toxic and infuriating to people, especially when they realize what's happening, that when we act in anger, that we can be bold, but we can also be unstrategic. And so the worry is that by sort of responding viscerally and emotionally, we will not do strategic things that are likely to work. And instead, we'll do things that maybe are emotionally satisfying, but that actually go down in flames. And so that's really the trick. The gender ideologues on the other side have been thinking and planning this for years. They have been cold and calculated in infiltrating our educational institutions and our culture. And if we're going to defeat it, we need to do the same. We need to be wise as serpent and innocent as doves. And the wise as serpents part, I think, is the part that we find hard. And so I want us first to understand it, and then to spend a few minutes talking about how we think we're most likely to defeat this at the state level, if that makes sense. And so a number of you, I think, don't have your mute on, and so I'm going to do the little tutorial here. And so basically on your screen, there's a little microphone down in the left-hand corner. And so that maybe if you're not sure where it is, it should be in the left part of your corner of your screen. So gender ideology, I mean, this is the term I use. And actually, if you're going to say what gender ideology is about, ultimately, it actually, in some ways, is a practical question, boils down to this single question. Should we, that is, we as a culture, we as teachers, we as parents, teach children that they may be born in the wrong body? So think about this idea, and you think about any other kind of issue. So think about anorexia nervosa, which is it's in the DSM-4, it's in the DSM-5. It is a widely recognized psychological disorder which involves a false perception of one's body. And so it's very common in girls, teenage girls in particular, not so common in boys, but it involves a false perception of what their body is like. And so they get the idea that they're overweight, they're really fat, they deprive themselves of food. In the case of anorexia nervosa and bulimia, they'll often binge and then throw it up. But in both cases, they don't perceive their bodies accurately. So imagine if we took young girls that are struggling with anorexia nervosa and told them that they were born in the wrong body, or told them that, okay, well, their perception of themselves and their body, that's who they really are, and that who they are is independent of their body. So what we ought to do is just do whatever we have to adjust their body to their perception. And so in this case, you might have a girl that's, down to 88 pounds or something. Like say she's a 17-year-old, so it's way too light. She's emaciated, but her self-perception, her weight identity is that she's really, really overweight. And so we would treat her presumably with more diets, liposuction, maybe exercising more intensely, which is completely insane. And we recognize that's insane because the problem is that she has a false perception of who she is. She's not really a fat person with a skinny body. She is someone who is very thin and is malnourished and doesn't accurately see herself as she really is. So the proper therapy is never going to be, well, adjust your body to your perception. It's going to be adjust your perception to reality. And so everyone recognizes that. And we recognize that in every other case, when you're dealing with psychological issues, that the job is to help people to live in reality and not to live in their illusions. When it comes to gender ideology, though, we literally will teach children that they can be born in the wrong body. And we might say that implicitly, by teaching them that who they really are is their gender identity, or explicitly that a child comes in and says that say she's feels a discordance between her sexed body and who she thinks she really is. And we will actually tell her, well, maybe you were born, maybe you're a boy trapped in a girl's body. It's not even clear. I don't even think this is a coherent idea. The only way you can even imagine this, what would it mean to be born in the wrong body? It would mean that you're this disembodied self that is not in any way naturally and intrinsically a physical thing. You're just this purely disembodied thing. And I don't know, so God took some souls and then he stuck them in this one body, but he actually had another body over here that was the one he was supposed to put you in. I mean, that's like the only way you can even imagine how this would be coherent. Nobody actually has that view theologically, obviously, and that's usually not what people are saying. And if you say, okay, so what would it mean to be a boy, okay, that's trapped in a girl's body? The only way you can give an account of that, if you're going to define boy without respect to the body, is in terms of stereotypes, in terms of, okay, what is the stereotypical way boys act? And so that ends up being what you actually do. And so this actually just answering this question the right way, if you say, no, we shouldn't teach kids this because it doesn't make any sense or whatever, you end up on one side of this issue. If you think, yeah, we should teach children that they could be born, maybe born in the wrong body, you're going to end up on the other side. Now, this is an idea that's, of course, all of us know has emerged in the last 10 or 15 years, and especially in the last, 7 years, since about 2015. This isn't a coincidence. And the reason it's not a coincidence is because children have been targeted in multiple ways. They've been targeted in the institutions that they respect and for which they have sort of authority representations like schools. And then they've received these ideas from truly influential social media figures, so that ideas that might have spread in neighborhoods or among communities before can now spread all around the world at roughly the speed of light, because we have a hyper-connected economy and information ecosystem that then also transmits these particular ideas. These are 3 books I've got on this slide. There are 3 kindergarten books designed to teach kids gender ideology. So if you have a kid's book that's in a children's library and a kindergarten book, what that means is that the project existed years ago, because you have to write the book, you have to get a publisher, you got to get an illustrator, you got to create award ceremonies that can feed the book with awards, so that then school boards and districts will adopt the book and then put them in the library. So remember, we may be just talking about this now. The people that wrote these books and that planned this were doing this 5, 7, 10 years ago. Let me give you one example. So It Feels Good to Be Yourself, which sounds very unassuming and nice, unless you notice the subtitle, a book about gender identity. And inside the book, it says, some people are boys, some people are girls, some people are both, neither, or somewhere in between. Right? So what's happening here? What's happening is that the purpose of this book and other books like this is to destabilize what would otherwise form in terms of the kind of conceptual categories, the categories that kids develop in order to understand the world. When it comes to concepts like adult and child and male and female, by the time kids are 5 or 6, those are very stable. And so in every culture and every time and place, people develop this idea that there are boys and girls, there are males and females. And it's very stable once you do it. We're actually really, really good as a species at recognizing males and females with an amazing degree of accuracy. We can be fooled, but it's actually really good. And so if you're going to get kids to deny that, you're going to have to reach them when they're really early and disrupt those categories. And that's exactly the purpose of this, is to get the idea in kids' heads that, yeah, there's some kids that could be boys or girls, but there's some that aren't either of them, or they're both of them, or they're somewhere in between. In other words, there's a spectrum. There's not this simple binary of male and female. This is an absolutely concerted campaign to do this to kids. This is why there's so much focus both on books like this, but also with things like drag queen story hours and drag queen book readings, because that destabilizes kids' ideas of the categories of sex, and in the sexual binary in particular. That's absolutely crucial. Now, this has gotten so bad. In fact, Robin sort of mentioned this briefly, that we had this massive explosion of incidents of kids presenting with these symptoms. She gave the statistic of 4,400% increase. That was a growth in one clinic in the United Kingdom, the Tavistock Clinic. They only have one major pediatric gender clinic. And so from 2019 or 2009 to 2019, they had an increase of 4,400% in the number of kids that were being referred to the Tavistock Clinic because of gender dysphoria. That's just the technical term for this perception of mismatch between your body and your so-called perceived gender. It's rapid onset. This is a term from a Brown University researcher, Lisa Lippman, in 2017, who noticed that we had a new thing on our hands. So historically, you would have a very rare instance of prepubescent boys that would struggle with this gender dysphoria. The vast majority, if allowed, to go through puberty in a normal way, maybe to receive counseling and psychotherapy, when they would get through puberty, they actually outgrow this. And so it looks like for most kids, the best known cure for prepubescent gender dysphoria is natural puberty itself. And so she said, but what's happening now, and in kids that did this, they usually would be, very often they might have it for several years. They're presenting it for several years, and then it was an actual problem. Rapid onset gender dysphoria, in contrast, would involve kids that are maybe early in puberty or before, and it would just suddenly happen. So a girl that has no sign that she has discomfort with her gender, or that she's even really atypical for a female in any obvious way, all of a sudden tells her parents that she thinks she's really a boy, or she's really asexual, or she's really non-binary, or one of these new categories. And very often girls will do this even in friend groups. It will happen simultaneously in a whole group of friends, which is precisely what you would expect if you were dealing with a social contagion that was spreading in some way. You weren't dealing with a kind of an actual psychological disease in the normal sense, but rather a contagion, a particular idea, just as nervous tics can spread among teenage girls and friends. And so it seems a little weird, but that's the reality, is we're social creatures. And so even things like this can actually spread socially. And so she called this rapid onset gender dysphoria. She said, let's do more research on it. And for her troubles, she practically had her career destroyed, and she's no longer at Brown University, and she's an independent researcher still working on this stuff. So that's the problem. And it's a problem that's not simply a pathology. It is caused by a particular ideology that has found its way both into our educational institutions and to our social media influencers, especially on sites like Instagram and TikTok, which no teenager should be on. So here's another example of this kind of growth. This was from 2010 and 11 to the present, just so you can see this. This was gender identity disorder in Tavistock. So you can see this kind of massive explosion over the course of, in this case, from 2010 to the present. So there was a dip you noticed there around 2020, 21. You probably guess what that dip is. The dip is when the lockdowns from COVID occurred in the UK and no one was getting treated for things, even people struggling with cancer. And so there was an artificial dip that's of course continued. And so this gives you a sense of the massive increase in how much this is happening. So I've talked a lot about the danger and where this stuff comes from. I haven't actually defined gender ideology. So how should we explain this? I think it's best to explain it in this way. We have a word in English, sex, and it's a strange word because it actually refers to two different things. It refers both to the fact that we are, as a species, binary with respect to our mode of production. And so what that means is that there are basically two categories of people, two categories of individuals in our species, just like every mammal actually. And we're all biologically complete as individuals for doing most things. So you don't need another person in order to be able to digest food or to be able to breathe or see or sleep. You do that on your own. You have all the equipment, if you're a healthy person, to be able to do that on your own. You cannot reproduce after our kind. You cannot reproduce a human by yourself. It requires exactly one fertile male and one fertile female coming together to be able to reproduce. So for that one biological function, it's a part of who we are biologically, it requires exactly one male and one female to do that. And the reason is because a new human organism is formed by the conjoining of two gametes. And the gametes are these sex cells. And you can actually define sex in this way. So what a male is basically a member of the species whose body is organized and under normal development at some time in his life cycle will produce sperm, and sperm are this kind of small mobile gametes. A female is an individual human, or a woman, let's say, is an individual female human that under normal development will produce large, relatively immobile gametes called eggs or ova at some point during her life cycle under normal development. So that doesn't mean a woman that is not producing these gametes isn't female. It means that under normal development, she would at some point in her life cycle. Okay, so now here's the key thing is that even people with disorders of sexual development, which is sometimes called intersex, that's actually a misnomer. So disorders of sexual development in which they have different kinds of chromosomes, or they don't develop ova, or they don't, or a male that doesn't develop the ability to produce sperm. They don't produce a third gamete. There is not a third gamete floating around out there. And so that is why we are binary. By definition, there's exactly two gametes and only two. It takes one of each and we produce a new organism. So we have an absolutely rock solid, locked down definition of what sex means in this biological sense. But there's a problem in that the word sex also is used to refer to the sex act, right? So the thing that we do, that adults ideally do in order to reproduce. And so we use that word sex to refer to both of these things. Not every language is like this. As a result, we have this other English word that's a more modest synonym for it, and it's the word gender. Now, gender really is basically a synonym for sex in the biological sense. It's related to generation, genealogy, genus. It connects to the kind of reproduction. And so people in certain settings sometimes would use the word gender when they meant sex. But of course, the most common use of this word is with respect to the endings on certain languages. And in some languages like Spanish and German and French, they have masculine, feminine, and neuter genders, right? And that's just the structure of their language. Old English, by the way, had this structure, but because of Viking incursions and complicated things, we all have ended up speaking English pidgin, so a simplified English that doesn't have all the complicated endings. So that's when we mostly would hear the word gender. So if, when I was a kid, I went to the doctor's office, it would ask my sex, male or female, right? Those are the two choices. That's almost been entirely displaced by the word gender. And that would have been fine as long as they were being used as synonyms. But another thing was happening at the same time. Just as we transition from this word sex to gender, the idea of gender, not as a synonym for sex, but as something else, was also taking place under the ground. And that was the kind of, think of it as the tectonic plates under the continents moving when no one's noticing it, right? So that all of a sudden, without anyone necessarily noticing it, the word gender was being used to refer to a different thing called gender identity. And so this is what gender ideology in essence is. It is a replacement of the sexual binary as a thing that we discover that's true about the world, that's, you know, a description of reality, with this category of gender identity. Now, people often think, well, that sounds kind of like it's the same thing. This is not the same thing at all. So probably until 3 years ago, you had never heard somebody say, or 5 years ago, what gender do you identify with? No one would have said that. In most cases, they wouldn't ask us, right? You would just be somebody, if you're a female, people could tell, and they would just assume that you're a female. Well, now you're asked, what is your gender identity? That is, what gender do you identify with? And that tells you that some kind of weird slippage has already happened. Now, here's the good news, is that we can actually, I can illustrate this for you with a tale of two diagrams. So this is a diagram that was widely used in public schools. I don't know if it's officially in any curricula, but it's used and was used for years around the country. This was something, an image diagram developed by a guy named Sam Kellerman to try to explain gender ideology. So basically, to catechize kids, to train them to think in terms of gender ideology rather than normal biological sex. And it went through different editions. This is version 3.3. And he kept trying to get it right. But because Sam Kellerman was already an adult and was having to learn gender ideology as an adult, didn't know it as a kid, he kept getting it wrong. So it worked its way into the system only to be denounced by committed gender ideologues. So first, let me introduce this, and then you'll see the change. So Kellerman says, rather than thinking of people as boys and girls, think of everyone as having these aspects, 4 different aspects. They have an identity, they have an expression, they have an attraction, and they have a sex, all right? And each of these can exist along a spectrum. So notice gender identity, there's a womanness and a manness, but they're just a line, but unlike a number line that has dashes on it, discrete dashes, right? It's just a pure spectrum, and people could exist anywhere along this spectrum. And so depending on where you are on that spectrum, that's going to determine your gender identity. And so there's really, in principle, no limit to how many different kind of gender identities you could have. But in the diagram, notice it's associated with the brain. Then you have attraction, and attraction refers to your romantic and sexual orientation. So that's what the word sexual orientation refers to, right? But notice that's different from your gender identity. Then there's your expression, which is just how you dress, how you express yourself, whether you wear makeup, the kinds of things you do. And then finally, there is, in this version of the genderbread person, a category biological sex. And so notice here, it's still kind of anchored in the body. Now, what's funny is that this didn't do the trick. This was actually, Kellerman in his genderbread person version 3.3 had not quite gotten it right. And so the really committed people said, okay, you really got this wrong. And you're probably guessing what he got wrong if you're paying attention based upon what I've said up to now. It's this right here, biological sex, right? They said, no, that's not going to do, because you can't, it's not just that there's a gender identity and then also biological sex. That doesn't really get at what we're saying. A couple of other problems. One is the brain. So there was this idea 10 years ago that maybe a boy that thinks he's a girl it's really a girl's brain entrapped in a boy's body, but we can actually do brain scans because there are kind of brain typical patterns for males and females. And you could actually, this is something you could actually analyze. Turns out it's not true. And a brain attaches at least still to a physical body. So if you connected the identity directly to the brain, in principle, you'd still be talking about biology. And then finally, the genderbread person looks like a man, looks like a gingerbread man, right? And so, of course, that's a problem. Well, there was an alternative to this called the gender unicorn. And this graphic developed by something called the Trans Student Educational Resources Organization. This gets gender ideology exactly perfect. And so I want you to just notice carefully the change. So first of all, it's a fantasy character that's not coincidental. It's a purple unicorn, which doesn't exist in real life. The unicorn's androgynous, so not obviously boy or girl. Notice there's no brain. There's only a thought of a rainbow. And so it's a thought bubble. And that's your gender identity, is your thought bubble. It's not your brain. It's this purely subjective, immaterial entity that Carl Trueman calls the psychological self. That's just this purely internal, disembodied entity, right? That's independent of your body. And so again, though, we have the gender identity, which is basically if you want to know what the definition of gender identity is, it's your internal sense of gender. Okay, this is a useless definition because we're wanting to know what gender identity is. You can't use the word gender in the definition, or it's just circular. And so that's why you can end up with furry as a gender identity, because it's now been totally detached from sex. Gender expression, again, physical attraction, emotional attraction. So they split that out. And then finally, here's the key. This is the kicker. The key change is right here. Sex assigned at birth. So rather than biological sex as a real thing, we have an internal psychological idea of our gender identity. And then rather than sex, we have merely this social convention in which doctors or nurses, they may assign a sex to you, but it doesn't actually tell you anything. There's not anything that's actually real about that. It's not an actual description of you. It's something imposed upon you. And so when I talk about this to people and they're not used to it, the reason I go through this is that people, when you tell them, oh, gender ideology denies biological sex, they'll say, no, that's not right. They accept sex. It's just that they say there's this other thing, gender. No, that is not what's happening at all. It is a complete upending and a displacement of biological reality in favor of a purely subjective idea of gender identity. And insofar as we have sex, it's merely sex assigned at birth, not biological sex. That's the essence of gender ideology. And so if you get that transition and what happened, you will get what gender ideology actually is. Now, this is one of the most radical ideas that anyone could possibly have proposed. If you spend any time studying it, you discover it's just almost completely incoherent. It falls apart all the time. So just give you one example. Your gender identity is entirely independent of your body. So if a person looks like someone's a female assigned at birth, it still looks like a female and has X chromosomes and secondary sex characteristics and all the rest. But she could, according to gender ideology, really be a male, whatever that means, and whatever her body is. Now, so she is already really a male, even though she has all this kind of female body parts. Why does she need to transform her body? She is already a female. Right? But then yet we're supposed to also kind of completely restructure the body. And so you get all these kinds of weird contradictions. The reason is because I think gender ideology gets the human person so badly wrong that it's constantly going to be predicting itself. And it's only based upon this idea that the idea of so-called gender affirming care can ever possibly make sense. Otherwise, no one would ever think that to treat a psychological ailment, you should cut off healthy body parts. No one would say, well, you know, the best cure for anxiety disorder is to chop off people's arms and legs. Even if that did reduce anxiety, nobody would think that was the proper standard of care for anxiety. We'd say, okay, well, that's weird. Now let's keep looking for a better alternative because that's too draconian. That's not what we do here. A child can simply report, a boy can report that he's really a girl. And in fairly short order, if he's young enough, he can end up with puberty blocking drugs and cross-sex hormones followed by surgery. And so that's actually the only way that you could ever get this idea that so-called gender affirming care makes any sense therapeutically. Now, what is gender affirming care? Y'all probably already talked about this week, but it's good to remember this because it's this particular pathway. So it's first kind of pioneered by some researchers in a Dutch study that's come to be called the Dutch protocol. Even though the way we practice it in the US is quite different. The idea is that you start with social transition, in which you have the psychosocial intervention in schools, and that's the pronouns and the changes of names, right? In which everyone participates in this idea that this boy is really a girl, and they start it with a social transition. And then if she's young enough, she could follow by puberty blockers, which I think basically freezes normal natural biological development, followed by cross-sex hormones, which in the case of a girl would be testosterone. Because many of the secondary sex characteristics, for boys, like chest hair and facial hair, larger muscles, structure, those kinds of things are just the result of the influence of testosterone. So you can actually you can do a lot of changing actually with drugs, but you're not going to completely remove organs, let alone create sort of mock simulacra of organs without surgery. And so that's why you eventually end up for girls with double mastectomy, so-called top surgery, and then radical hysterectomy and things like that. For boys, it's castration and the removal of the penis, and then eventually even the fashioning of fake body parts that weren't there before. Now that only makes sense. Again, why would we do that? We only do that if the real person is this internal gender identity. And so the way you treat that is to refashion the body with drugs and with surgical interventions. But then you might say, well, now why would a parent ever agree to this? It seems really draconian. Well, all you have to do is think about this as a parent. This probably, if you're not sort of sold on the ideology already, to hear this, you're not going to want to do this as a parent, except for one thing. If you can, what's a worse outcome? So if you have a son that says he wants to be a girl and undergo this surgical transition, what would be a worse outcome than that? Well, a worse outcome would be suicide. And so parents overwhelmingly are told by clinicians, by counselors, by teachers, that this is the best way to prevent children from committing suicide. And in fact, children that are not given gender affirming care are very likely to commit suicide. So this is the dilemma that parents often have to deal with, this emotional blackmail, where they're told, do you want a live son or a dead daughter, or the opposite? So you see the problem is that it's not that millions of parents are dying to do this to the kids, is that they're told by all the relevant medical officials that this is the way you prevent your child from committing suicide. And so it's terrifying. And so many of them will go along. Now, there's some parents that weirdly, because they have been themselves completely schooled in gender ideology, and there's almost a weird chic into having a transition kid. But I think those are not nearly as common as parents who just are doing this because they're told that's what they're supposed to do. Now, I can spend a bunch of time on the science. I won't spend a lot, except I do want to tell you that the basis for the initial basis for the claims of gender affirming care, as I mentioned, was based upon a single Dutch study, did not have a control group. It was not a double-blind randomized control trial. It started with 70 subjects. It ended with 55 subjects. And it was also a really careful, rigorous study. So kids were excluded for all sorts of reasons psychologically. They were given psychological counseling throughout the process. And it was so precise, even though I wouldn't endorse it, many of the people involved in the Dutch study actually criticized the United States because we claim we're following this pathway when in fact we're not. We don't have any of the safeguards that we do. But it's a very, very, very thin evidential base on which to make this claim. And then what about the suicide claim? Well, there's a bunch of stuff to say about this, but it's really based upon 3 highly ideological studies that again use convenient samples, questionnaires sent out to transgender activist organizations that supposedly showed this. There's really not good evidence for this, and in fact, there's good evidence that it's not true. I don't want to run the clock out completely, so maybe I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but my colleague Jay Green at the Heritage Foundation actually analyzed this claim and has a paper that if you go to the Heritage Foundation website, type in Jay Green, gender affirming care suicide, Green, it's Greene. He did a study in which he compared states where kids could get access to puberty blocking drugs without their parents' permission to states where they couldn't. So in some states, teenagers could get it without their parents' permission, and in others, some they could, some they couldn't. What he found is that there was an actual increase in the rate of suicide in those states where kids had easier access to these drugs once these drugs started becoming popular. So if anything, they're probably increasing the rate of suicide rather than anything else. All right. And then this says nothing that I've said has to do with the actual damage from gender affirming care. We know that puberty blockers themselves could be very dangerous, especially for girls. They can lead to long-term and maybe permanent problems in bone growth and developmental anomalies. So the fact that their puberty might kick back in 3 years later when they get off these drugs doesn't mean that they're not really dangerous. Then you move to things like cross-sex hormones. There are all sorts of physical problems and physical outcomes of this. We're running an uncontrolled experiment on kids. You give a girl high doses of testosterone, you're going to atrophy her ovaries, you're going to atrophy her uterus, you're going to change the structure of her face and her shoulders and her bones. You're going to increase risks of cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, all sorts of things. And then, of course, the obvious is that these transition surgeries, by definition, sterilize children. And so that is a massive counterindication if your intervention actually sterilizes a child. Bunch of activist groups behind this. In fact, I've got a bunch of stuff on that, but if you're wondering, it goes all the way from the American Academy of Pediatrics to the equality groups in every state, to Planned Parenthood, to the ACLU, to an organization called WPATH that pushes this stuff. They all have the appearance of science. Every single one of them is a deeply committed ideological group. These are not careful kind of scientific organizations. So what can we do? When you first learn about this stuff, it's so outrageous that the temptation for people, for citizens, and for state legislators is to ban this, is to say, okay, let's make it a crime to do these procedures. Let's make it a crime to socially transition kids. Let's make it a crime, certainly to give them puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and to operate on them and remove healthy organs. And so this is what Alabama did. They made it a Class C felony. In Texas, the Attorney General ruled that these procedures would be treated going forward as child abuse. And then in Arkansas passed a law called the SAFE Act, which prohibited but didn't actually criminalize the procedures. So what they did in Arkansas is they prohibited it, so that would basically said this isn't a proper standard of care. Doctors that do this might lose their licenses. But they didn't empower the state or the attorney general to arrest people. So there's no criminal penalties. What they did is they conferred what's called a private right of action, which just means that they gave people the right to sue doctors for doing this to them. And then they also increased the statute of limitations for 20 years past their 18th birthday. So if you're a girl that gets your breast removed for gender affirming reasons when you're 16, you turn 18, you have the right to sue that doctor until you're 38 years old. And so before it was only 2 years. So you can see how that alone is going to change the incentives for malpractice insurers, for the doctors, for the clinics, because they realize, I can get sued for decades from now. And so that's actually, we think that's probably the very best law. But notice in all those cases, the instinct was to have the legislature get involved right away and to prohibit these, either make them criminal or to declare them child abuse. Now, I totally get this. I changed my career to focus on this stuff. I want it gone. I want gender clinics closed. I want them sued to oblivion, and I want them all to have to confess their crimes. But what you want to have happen isn't necessarily what's possible in the near term. And if you try to go for something at the wrong time, you can actually create a bad legal precedent that will make it harder to deal with in the future. That is especially true right now, and it's for this reason. Virtually all the official medical organizations say this is the proper standard of care. The American Medical Association, American Academy of Pediatrics say this is the proper standard of care. And if you were to ask a judge or even just an ordinary citizen, okay, whose jurisdiction should it be? Who's the one that should make a call about whether a medical treatment is the proper treatment? Is that going to be a judge? It seems like a weird thing. Is it going to be a school principal? That seems odd. Will it be a member of the state legislature? That seems weird too. What you would expect is that, well, no, it's going to be medical boards. Medical boards, the experts, they're going to be the ones that decide what a proper standard of care is. And that's exactly how judges think. And so when these laws have been passed in the last year, they almost immediately end up in litigation. They're mostly going to probably be likely to be struck down. The reason is because they have they've tried to do something without air cover from some kind of medical authority. And we knew a year ago this was going to be a problem, but there's only one state in the union willing to do this differently. Now, what state has over the last 3 years tended to do things differently, bravely? The state of Florida. In the state of Florida, the legislature did not do anything with this over the last year. What they did is they spent a year with the governor-appointed Board of Health, did research, they held hearings, they had depositions, they brought in kids who had been treated in this way, they brought in experts from Europe who had had second thoughts about this. They issued a 300-page report that they posted on the website. Let me just click past here. Which they issued this summer. All right. And so essentially what it said is the Florida Department of Health in their Agency for Health Care Administration said there's no good evidence. It said that this treatment, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, sex hormone reassignment surgery is not consistent with widely accepted professional medical standards and are experimental and investigational with potential long-term effects. Therefore, no Medicaid dollars will be spent on this. And then last week, the Board of Medicine and the Board of Osteopathic Medicine voted the same way. Now, notice the difference here is that these official medical boards in the state of Florida have now issued a judgment that this is not good treatment. Now, if the state legislature in Florida steps in and says, okay, we're going to make these illegal, that's the ACLU is going to sue them. It's exactly what's going to happen. A judge isn't going to be able to say, well, the legislature acted outside its authority, because all they're doing is following the relevant medical authority. This is the way it needs to be handled in every state where it can be done this way. And so we're going to need states in which you have a governor that's willing to do it, that's inclined to do it, that has the ability to appoint members to the board to do it this way. And if we jump the gun with legislative attempts to ban these things ahead of time, what we're going to get is courts striking these things down in bad legal precedents. What we want is 6 or 8 or 10 states doing what Florida has done, so that at the end of the year, there's going to be a fight. It's going to be a fight against the Department of Justice and Health and Human Services and the federal government under President Biden, and these 6 or 8 or 10 states who said, actually, the science says exactly something else. And we're going to have a national fight, and the fight is going to be over the science and the medicine. And when that's the fight, we win that. When that's not the fight, we are going to lose. And this has been the concern for those of us that are deep down in the policy, is that states will think that there's the way to do this is just to legally ban it. And what they're going to find is that it's going to cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars in litigation, and it's actually not going to work for this reason. This is different from other kinds of situations in that we have got ideological capture of all these medical organizations saying this is a good thing. Look, the Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C. right now says gender affirming care is the standard of care. In other words, it is the way to treat kids. So that is a different kind of problem that requires a different solution. We've got to challenge them with other medical authorities in states where they can be appointed. And we're not saying that states and places like Florida should make up the evidence. Of course not. What we're saying is that they get appointed, and you appoint the people that are willing to actually look at the evidence and to speak in favor of reality in the evidence. So this is a really important point that it needs to happen. Not every state is going to work this way, because some have medical boards that just going to do whatever they want to do. But in states where this can happen, this is what we think ought to happen. And then once you've got a medical judgment by your Surgeon General or your Board of Health, then you implement a law like the SAFE Act in Arkansas, or a similar law called Help Not Harm, that prohibits, it gives kids and parents the right and ability to sue and does all those kinds of things. So that's the sequence, right? Governor appointed regulatory judgment, then the legislature, in that order. Now, this will end one way or the other, but it may be 10 years from now, and because there's a growing army of so-called detransitioners. Detransitioners are people, very often kids, that partly transition. They may have just taken cross-sex hormones. They may have had a double mastectomy, gone all the way. And then they realize it's a terrible mistake, and they detransition. This is a picture of detransitioners at the hearings before the Board of Medicine 2 weeks ago in Florida. These are, it's a growing army, literally, of people, kids, often now adults, walking around angry, articulate, that can describe what was done to them and the deception and the destruction. Eventually, these clinics get sued into oblivion. There'll be massive class action lawsuits, but state legislators have to confer on them a right to do that legally. But that's how I've always thought this probably ends, is with class action lawsuits. What I don't want to have happen is have to wait 10 years until there are 100,000 sterilized kids before we can do something about it. We can win this. We can beat it at the state level as long as we're just careful and strategic and work together. And so I am super optimistic that we don't need to wait for this lawfare 10 years from now. We can actually solve it as a policy thing at the state level. And then hopefully in 2025, we will be able to do it at the federal level. Here's the good news. Reality is on our side. When you're dealing with a debate in which one side is contrary to reality and one side conforms to reality, reality wins in the end. The question is how many lives are destroyed before we're actually able to do that. So I know I've given you a lot, but we have at least a few minutes, and I'd love to take some questions. Thanks so much, Robin. I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Richards. Are there any questions?
If anybody wants, you can just put the little hand up you just click the hand thing, and we can somebody can call on you.
Or if you're not familiar with the hand thing, you can unmute and ask, or utilize the chat.
Yeah, that's right. You can also just type it into the chat. Robin, anything unclear on your end that you think ought to clarify?
No, I think it's really good information. And I think that it's timely because, as you know, Matt Walsh did,
yes,
blew the lid off of Vanderbilt back in October.
Yep.
Which made national headlines. And now our governor is apparently sponsoring legislation. But
yeah, it's not the governor, actually. It's actually a member of the legislature. So I've spent 5 hours today talking to people in Tennessee. So I'll sort of tell you this. So we are really concerned about this because we don't think that this bill is well written. We think it's going to go down in flames like it did in Alabama. And we really think the governor needs to, it's going to depend on the details of the state, but there is an executive authority that the governor has with the regulatory agencies in the state of Tennessee. And if they are woke, they're still under his authority. And so he needs to fire them and replace them. They need to issue a judgment on this. If the legislature passes something to prohibit this, they're going to be acting independently of their own health authority in their own state. And so it's going to feel good. Matt, he's a great guy. He's an amazing documentary. He doesn't study these things. And so he's talking about it. He's chatting up a bill that we are afraid is going to go down in flames. The first sign of a court that sees it. And this is a perfect example where doing something that feels hardcore and viscerally satisfying may be exactly what we don't want to do. The governor needs to, there's something that the governor needs to do here before the legislature does it. The question is going to be how that's going to work. And I can tell you that every policy organization that's analyzed these bills and has been working on this, today we've had private discussion, is really worried about this bill in Tennessee. Not because we don't think that it shouldn't be prohibited ultimately, we do, but because by ignoring these details, you're going to end up with another situation like you have in Alabama, where the Department of Justice just comes in and sues you, and a judge says, well, all the medical groups over here are saying one thing, the legislature is saying the other. No judge is going to go with the legislature over the healthcare bureaucracy. And so you got to do things in the right order. That's just the kind of the brutal reality of it. And the good news is a pathway to do this. It'd be really depressing if we didn't have a way to do this, but this stuff has to be carefully thought through, and it's got to be done in the right order. And so Tennessee is going to end up being a hot spot for this in the next few months. So this is obviously, we set this up before any of that happened, so I've literally spent half the day talking to people in the governor's office, talking to other policy groups, trying to decide what to do about it.
Well, you'll find that Tennessee doesn't necessarily act for the emotion or the quick satisfaction of doing something. We found that it's for political expediency. And, we have an anti-CRT law here in Tennessee, which has done nothing to prevent the teaching of CRT.
No, that's the problem. Yeah. And so it can look good.
The governor, we had a big stink, a lot of awareness raised last year by John Rich with the library books. He testified before the House committee, and the governor pushed through a library bill, which has only emboldened librarians to push even more radical materials into our libraries. So there's a history here with this administration of passing bills that do nothing. In fact,
that's right. Yeah, and that's frustrating because in this case, of course, you have a, yeah, I mean, what the governor does in a state is he signs bills. It's somebody in the legislature has to actually submit and they have to pass. And so that's where it is right now. It's just been filed. You can go online and look, but that's exactly what I'm worried about is it'll look good. It might be good PR. 6 months from now, it's going to get sued. It's going to go down in flames anyway. And then we're going to have a bunch of bad precedents in the courts. That's really worrisome. So somebody asked if I could please show the chart slide. Yeah, with the organizations. I'll pull that up again real quick. Yeah, so I know we're going to switch to January real quick. Let me just find that slide though. Where is that? Right here we go. This is it. So these are just some of the main players. So I just picked Equality Florida. I'm sure there is an Equality Tennessee, probably there's an Equality Montana. They usually have the name Equality in them. They're all separate 501c3s, so there's no official parent organization, but it's all the same donors that are behind this. Planned Parenthood, you might be wondering about that. They pour huge amounts of money into this. They are also one of the main dispensers of cross-sex hormones. So we did research about a year ago at Heritage, and we found at the time that 260 of the 600 or so Planned Parenthood facilities will dispense cross-sex hormones, and they'll often do it on the first appointment without a psychological evaluation. So a teenage girl can go in and get massive doses of testosterone from Planned Parenthood. So they're kind of on brand. I mean, initially you think, well, that's weird. I thought they did birth control and abortions. But Planned Parenthood actually was founded by Margaret Sanger, who is a eugenicist that was worried about human population and population control. So, sterilizing kids is actually on brand if you're looking at its actual origins. It's just that it's obviously a different thing than what they were doing before.
Okay, any other questions?
All right, well, it's great to
Chuck,
know.
you're on mute. I
Oh,
see you
Chuck, you.
talking.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, one of the problems I think with Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 1 is it doesn't have a findings portion at the beginning of the bill.
Yep.
Like if they said, and they kind of get away from the science. I mean, this is kind of radical view, but it says, what does it mean to be human? And go back to the common law.
Right.
That was used in the Dobbs decision. That what you're actually doing is preventing a child from becoming a parent.
Yeah.
If they could argue that way, then you could have a whole new path, because then if you had the findings section, the judge would have to consider to implement that finding. I mean, that's the rationale for the law, rather than going the science route. What do you think?
Yeah, and so the problem is that because when you're just talking now, there's be ways to do stuff I haven't talked about the kind of rules and laws that you could do on the school side. Like, remember, Florida also did the Parents' Rights in Education bill, which is going to be fine because it's not involved in healthcare per se. It's educational. Social transition really is a healthcare intervention. It just happens in the school. So that's why we talk about the school, this clinic or sterilization pipeline. Findings is absolutely crucial. The problem is, as long as this is treated as healthcare, which is what it is, if you're giving a child drugs or surgery, the deference is going to go to the perceived authorities, and that's going to be the medical authorities. And so what you want is, like, you want a big old thing about what it includes in its findings, the findings of the relevant medical authority in that state. And so, and I'm not saying just trust the medical authorities. The reason we have to do this is because most of the medical authorities have been captured. We need, though, findings and research and a conclusion from some relevant health agency. The legislature just says, we're following them. And then the judge is like, I can't do anything about it.
No, I get that. I think that's perfectly logical. We ought to do it that way. But I mean, to argue from what it means to be a human, because actually the parents, what if you had a parent that said, my constitutional rights are being violated because I've consented to have the kid, transition. And then but you argue that the kid's constitutional rights as a person, as a human, are being violated because you're taking away the ability to be a parent.
Yeah,
I mean, you have to.
Yeah, I totally agree philosophically and constitutionally. I just don't think any judge is going to do that in the same way that they wouldn't, because remember, they're conceding that it involves sterilization, but no judge. So let's say a child had testicular cancer and the only way to cure it was to remove their testes. That would sterilize them, right? But you wouldn't think in that case, okay, they needed to have that removed. So it's not a constitutional violation. That's how they're thinking of gender transition, right? They're thinking of it as, oh, well, yeah, it's draconian, but this is the only way people kill themselves, right? And so you've got to refute that. You got to make sure the judge can't
Right.
you can't just grant him that assumption. And so if you have a medical authority say, no, there's no good evidence of this, in fact, it doesn't help, then it's completely undercut. And they really, that's when, that's how we win. And so this is why here's my fear is that a year from now, we've got 6 states that did this the wrong way. The ACLU has sued all of them.
Yeah.
They don't do anything with states like Florida, which are good ones, but they jam up the kind of court system. And what they hope is that the bad ones get to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court doesn't, will just sort of dismiss it because they didn't get the right case. That's the worry. And so what we want them is to have to get the right case. And then we think it's a slam dunk. It's just that the ACLU really wants us to do this the wrong way. They're really hoping for that. And at the moment, we're mostly delivering except for Florida. And now the good news is that Florida's done it. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just do what they did. That's the exciting thing. Well, this is great. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for, I know I would, sort of squeeze this in the middle of another conference that I'm doing, but I was glad I'd be able to participate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richards. We appreciate your time.
You bet.
All right. Moving on, January Littlejohn is a wife and stay-at-home mom to 3 children in Tallahassee, Florida. She has a master's degree in counseling and an education specialist degree. She is also a licensed mental health counselor in Florida. Her free time is devoted to educating parents, school officials, and mental health professionals on the dangers of gender ideology and trying to restore parental rights in our schools. She also helps parents whose children have fallen prey to this ideology find resources and treatment options to support their family. So please welcome January Littlejohn.
Thank you so much for having me, Robin.
And just tell me when to do the slide.
I'm just actually going to start out by speaking. The slides that I gave you of resources, we can do at the end.
Okay.
Thank you. So I'm just going to go into kind of how I got involved in this issue. And in the summer of, it was actually spring of 2020, our daughter came to us and told us she was experiencing confusion over her sex. And this was after 3 other friends at her school had also suddenly claimed transgender identities. And that in itself gave me pause, because in my clinical training, statistically, this wasn't possible. Transgenderism was very rare. I never encountered it in all the years that I was counseling on college campuses or adolescents. I worked on 2 different college campuses. And so it was extremely rare. So when my daughter expressed to us that she was experiencing confusion over her sex, we were really taken back. We were very concerned. She had expressed no gender confusion leading up to this announcement. And we elicited the help of a mental health professional to help us navigate this with our daughter. So after school started, several weeks into school, our daughter gets into the car. She's 13 at the time and says, "Mom, I had a meeting today about my name, and they asked me which restroom I wanted to use." I was immediately outraged. I was confused as to why they had a meeting that I wasn't notified or invited to attend. My daughter has diagnosed ADHD, and so she has a 504 plan on file, which I know as a licensed mental health counselor that I have to be present for all of those meetings. They need me to be present as her parent. So it really did not make sense to me that the school was having a meeting with our daughter without notifying me. I contacted the guidance counselor whom I knew, and I was called back with both the guidance counselor and the assistant principal, and was told my daughter was now protected under a non-discrimination law. They could not give me any information about what happened at the meeting. And my only recourse was to speak to an assistant superintendent at the district. So right off the bat, I knew something was very wrong. My mind was blown that, number one, they had met with my daughter in private. She's 13. They can't give her medication without my signature. They can't even show her a PG-13 movie at age 13 without my signature. So I did not all of that understand why all of a sudden I was now cut out of this private meeting they'd had with my daughter, what I thought was completely inappropriate. So after many weeks of going back and forth with the assistant superintendent, we were finally able to get a meeting with our principal of the middle school. And we were shown the transgender, gender nonconforming support plan they completed with our 13-year-old daughter. This was done behind closed doors with 3 school officials that comprised of a school counselor, a social worker I had never met, and the assistant principal. And what this was a 6-page document that would have absolutely impacted her safety, where they asked her which name and pronouns she wanted to use, which restroom she wanted to use, and which sex she preferred to room with on overnight field trips. Then in these support plans, they do something particularly egregious. They ask the child, how should we refer to you? What name should we use when speaking to your parents? And that is to essentially deceive parents that this meeting and this support plan had ever taken place. So you have a situation where friends at school, school staff, bus driver, teachers, principal, admin, all know this child is experiencing confusion over their sex, and the only people that are kept in the dark purposefully are the parents, the people that love their child and know their child the most. And so what we found ourselves in was a situation where our rights had been completely violated. We were under the impression that as soon as we bring this to the attention of the superintendent and we tell them what's happening, they're going to be just as horrified as we were. Well, a month and a year later from the violation occurring, we filed a federal lawsuit for parental rights violation. And what I learned through the research that I did was that this was not an isolated incident that occurred with our daughter. I have been contacted by parents, not just in Florida, but all over the United States. I have spoken to parents in Alaska, parents in New York, Washington, Oregon, I mean, literally all over the US. And what I learned that was occurring in Florida was activist groups you saw in Jay's slide, one of which is Equality Florida. They had begun working within the public school system around 2016 under the guise of safe schools. They had an entire staff and department devoted to this. And what they did was they would go into the schools and implement these LGBTQ guides. They called them support guides. And it was very strategic because they call them guides, not policies, because policies have to go through the light of day through the school board for a vote. Guides do not. So they were training everybody on campus all throughout Florida. They prided themselves on being into 63 out of the 67 counties in Florida, partnering with them, training their staff, their staff, their teachers, their admin on quote unquote best practices. But within these guides, they completely misinterpreted state and federal laws and claimed that children, minor children, had a right to privacy from their parents. The other thing that they did in these trainings, and I can read verbatim, thankfully, this particular guide that was in existence at the time of the parental rights violation that occurred with our daughter has been rescinded. But I can guarantee you this same language and these same guides are still in multiple schools across our country. But one of the questions was, a student has exhibited behavior in school, leading administrators or teachers to believe the student is LGBTQ. Should the parents or legal guardians be notified? Answer, no. Outing a student, especially to parents, can be very dangerous to the student's health and well-being. Some students are not able to be out at home because their parents are unaccepting of LGBTQ+ people. As many as 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ+, many of whom have been rejected by their families for being LGBTQ. Outing students to their parents can literally make them homeless. So what they were doing is painting this false narrative that all parents are a danger to their child, regardless of whether this was true or not. They're assuming this. And I'm sure that this is the case in other states, but in the state of Florida, if you think a child is being abused or neglected in any way, they are mandated by the state to report that to our Department of Children and Families. It's like a Child Protective Services. But they were not doing that. They were just systematically cutting parents out of these critical conversations that would have absolutely impacted their safety and presuming all parents to be the enemy to their child, but only in this one area. Because once again, let me remind you, I was volunteer of the year at this middle school. They knew who I was. I was present for every school activity, volunteering in the field days, running their red, white, and blue day. But I was only cut out of this meeting. So a question parents should be asking is, why only in this area are they wanting to exclude parents? And what this is doing is, first and foremost, this process of these gender support plans, Jay used the term social transitioning. That is what this was. And social transitioning is a psychosocial medical intervention that schools are grossly unqualified to be doing, but especially without parental notification and participation. And one of the reasons why this is such an important issue is because many of these kids that are falling prey to gender ideology and this false notion that they were born in the wrong body, or they may, they need this gender identity to become their authentic self. Many of them, I would say the majority of these kids, and mostly girls, have co-occurring mental health issues and sometimes significant issues. Many of them have previous sexual or physical trauma. They have a history of anxiety and depression, self-harm, eating disorders, ADHD, and up to 40% of these girls are on the spectrum. So when you see the schools as ground zero for this type of indoctrination, and then you see that the school is only affirming these children, oftentimes without the parents knowing, in this false identity, and you know that social transition is the first step toward medical transition, this is why Jay said schools have become a gateway to sterilization. So it's a really significant problem that I myself was not aware of. I was not aware of the social contagion aspect until this happened to my family. I was not aware, certainly, that schools were doing this behind the backs of parents. And what I think is the most alarming for parents in my position, not just to understand that you've got Equality Florida and GLSEN and PFLAG and the Human Rights Campaign and Planned Parenthood interjecting this really non-scientific, harmful ideology into our schools. But when you find out and discover what gender affirming care is, that this is experimental puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and surgeries that they are performing on children whose brains are not fully developed and cannot consent to this. They do not have the cognitive maturity to even fathom how they're going to feel about a radical double mastectomy at age 15 when they're 25. They just don't. And so a real important ethical decision becomes, can children self-ID to self-sterilize? Because that's what's happening. And if people say, if they argue, no, it's not the children that are consenting to this, their parents. Okay, well then do parents have the right then to make choices based on a feeling in a child's mind to sterilize that child, to take away their future sexual function? Do parents have that right to do that to their own children? And I don't always blame the parents, because one thing that Jay hit on is one thing that I am hearing time and time again from parents, is that suicide has been weaponized against these parents and weaponized into affirming. A lot of times parents are told in front of their children, if you don't affirm your child and put them on this path of lifelong medical transition, your child will commit suicide. It's told to them as if it's a guaranteed outcome, not simply a risk factor. And as a mental health professional, I know what ethical mental health treatment looks like. This is not it. We do not treat suicidal ideation in this manner in any other circumstance. We do not simply affirm anything a client says, especially something as significant as this massive lie that is being sold to children. There's actually multiple lies. Lie number one is that sex is a spectrum. That is not true. Sex is binary. There is no a girl with a boy brain or a boy with a girl brain, and you can't be neither or both. There is no non-binary chromosomes. There is no gender fluid chromosomes or any other countless genders that Robin mentioned. Lie number two, they are being taught that if you don't like your body and you want to become a boy, if you're a girl or vice versa, that you can. That is not possible. But yet they are diluting and using these euphemisms like top surgery to describe a double mastectomy. Bottom surgery is used to describe surgical castration. And what is happening is these girls who are already vulnerable to this ideology for whatever reason, they're already uncomfortable with their developing bodies. And it's causing them to essentially disassociate from the body parts that are making them feel discomfort. And so what I mean by that is you actually hear these girls requesting binders, which is a very tight, almost like corset, which will bind their breast, and it causes breathing difficulties. It deforms the breast tissue. I have actually heard of girls getting their cracked lungs and even collapsed lungs from wearing these too long and for them being too tight. And what they're trying to do is minimize the appearance of the breast. Or they are asking for double mastectomies and getting them. We're talking ages 13 all the way up to 17 years old. So those are the first two lies. The third lie is that affirmation is the only treatment available. That is not true. And in fact, the standard treatment used to be watchful waiting before activism really overtook our medical and psychological associations. And watchful waiting is when you provide a neutral environment to a child with love and support and psychotherapy to address either root causes or co-occurring issues. And you give that child time to mature, their brain time to mature. And what research has shown is the vast majority of these adolescents, once they go through puberty, they will resolve their distress on their own. So parents that are taking their children for help at these gender clinics, they are not being told this information. They are not being given the option of watchful waiting, and they are not being told that the majority of these children, if you do nothing and give them counseling, exploratory therapy, that the majority of these children will desist and become comfortable in the body that they were born in. The fourth lie is the suicide lie. And that is, if you don't immediately affirm, your child will commit suicide. Now, let me be clear. Suicidal ideation is a risk factor for this population. But that is even more of a reason why it's so outrageous that they are cutting parents out of these conversations. If a child is expressing suicidal ideation, that child's parents absolutely needs to be involved so that they can get their child help right away. It is unacceptable that they would be taking a vulnerable population of children and cutting the parents out. But not only that, it's just not true. And in fact, professionals within WPATH Association, for those that you don't know, WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And this kind of used to be the go-to of where all of these quote unquote standards of care came from. And I say standards of care, but WPATH itself acknowledges that they are not standards of care, they are guidelines. However, you have the Endocrine Society, the APA, the AMA, the American Pediatrics Association, you have all these medical and psychological associations adopting these standards of care as if they are true evidence-based standards. And once you actually start to look at the evidence behind these interventions, behind these experimental puberty blockers, hormones, and surgeries, it falls apart very quickly because it is very low quality evidence. And that's why what Jay is saying about Florida is so important. You have other countries like the UK, Finland, and Sweden, where this issue has not been politicized like it has been in this country, who have done a proper risk analysis. They've done an assessment. They're looking as doctors at this information and saying, do the risk outweigh the benefits? What do we know? What evidence do we have? Are children being harmed? And the answer was yes. Children are absolutely being harmed. Proper assessments were not being done. Children were being fast-tracked down this medical pathway only to then regret it and detransition. And these are irreversible treatments. A girl that cuts her breast off at 15 cannot get her breast back. A girl that starts testosterone at age 15 and 16, those voice changes don't change back. Many of these girls experience rapid receding hairlines that hair does not grow back. When you have bone density loss from puberty blockers, we have no idea what that's going to do to that child's bones long term. Once a child has been chemically castrated and sterilized, that is irreversible. We have no idea how much does it take, how long does it take, because everybody's body chemistry is different, and we don't even have information on long-term effects of these drugs being used in this manner. This is all being used off-label in terms of FDA approval, all of it. So I know I'm throwing a lot at you all. I think it's just really important for parents to be aware that it's already in your schools, because if it's not being explicitly taught in curriculum like it is in California, New Jersey, Oregon, Washington, then the kids are being exposed to it through clubs like PRISM, GSA, Pride clubs, Rainbow clubs. It's called something different at every school. And a lot of these identities are very enticing. You know, having an identity crisis as an adolescent, this is not a new thing. In fact, that's a normal part of adolescence, to grow and rebel against your parents and push the boundaries and try on new things and outfits and experiences. But what is new for this generation is how they have normalized a mental health issue, and it's being celebrated for these kids. They are being told they are brave to come out as non-binary, demi-girl, demi-boy, transgender. You know, transgender no longer has any kind of coherent meaning. Transgender means whatever it means to that individual person. So we're talking about children at age 10 and 11 identifying as bisexual, pansexual, and they've never even been kissed. They have no concept of what these sexualities mean. They have no concept of what these gender identities mean or the consequences of going down this pathway mean. But I can tell you, many of these children and teens, they are experiencing true emotional pain, but they have misdiagnosed their pain, and they have been fed a lie that gender identity is the solution to their pain. And the reason why this is so dangerous is because what they are being told is the only way to alleviate this pain is to transition. And when the schools are socially transitioning these children, you're making the idea in their mind that they are born in the wrong body, that this is the right path, and it makes them less likely to desist. But it also creates a huge wedge between that parent and child. Educators and research has shown for decades that parental involvement in a child's education is one of the most important factors in successful outcomes for those students. So why are we suspending reality, but just in this one area, and cutting parents out of these issues? So I would encourage everybody to know, what is your school's policy? If a child comes to the guidance counselor or a teacher and says, I think I'm confused about my sex, or I think I'm transgender, and I want to change my name from Tammy to Tommy and use he, him pronouns, and I want to have access to the boys' locker room and the boys' bathroom. What is your school's policy? Will you be immediately contacted by that guidance counselor and you brought into these conversations? If you choose to prevent your child from going down a harmful pathway and you choose a watchful waiting intervention, are they going to honor that decision? Or will they affirm that child in spite of your wishes? These are really important questions, because I can guarantee your child has already been exposed to some level of this ideology. And the way to find out is to ask them, what are you hearing about gender? Have your friends talked about a non-binary identity? Tell me about that. Be curious. See how much they think they know. And my call to action for parents is to make sure that you are inoculating your children from this, that they know that there are only two sexes, and no matter what a person does to their physical self, you can never change your sex. And I do not mean that to be uncompassionate. I have the utmost compassion for children, teens, and adults struggling with confusion over their sex. It is a terrible, terrible mental health issue, but it's a mental health issue. We should not be making irreversible changes to children's bodies based on a child's self-ID and feeling. Because as you all know, feelings are not facts, and children have feelings that change rapidly and often during adolescence. The other thing that I think is really important to understand about this ideology is that it falls apart very quickly with any kind of questioning or scrutiny, very quickly. So on the one hand, they claim that gender identity is innate, and transgender children know as early as age 3 and 4 what their gender identity is. So if that's the case, then how can you also claim that gender identity is a spectrum and it's fluid and it can change over time? Those two truths cannot coexist at the same time. There is no such thing as a transgender child. There are children that are confused over their sex. There are children with gender dysphoria, and those children need the help of the adults in their life and mental health professionals to make sense of that confusion. That is really, really important for you all to understand. So the warning signs, I get asked that a lot. The warning signs would be your child spending a lot of time on social media, spending a lot of time alone, spending a lot of time talking to you about gender, coming out as one of the sexual orientations as a precursor to these trans identification, to these trans identities, coming home with any kind of propaganda, wearing pride flag pins, pronoun pins, participating in the GSA club, telling you some of their friends are transgender, like multiple friends. Like, oh, mom, you can't call Tammy anymore. Tammy's a boy now. You have to call him Tommy. So it's almost like for them, it's that simple. Like you dress a certain way and you change your name and pronouns and poof, you're the opposite sex. We know as adults, that is not reality. My other advice is once you find out what these policies are, get them in writing. Make sure that when you are reaching out to these professionals that you're not having a sidebar conversation at car pickup. And if you do have a sidebar conversation, follow up with an email. CC the principal and the superintendent and say, I just want to follow up with a conversation that we had about what your policies are at such and such a school. And that way you are sure to get in writing what the school is telling you. And the last thing that I will leave you with, and Robin, if you can put the resources page up there. I believe there's 2. So resources for education, Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier. This was the book that came out in 2020 that was based on Dr. Littman's research that Jay mentioned. The Person in an Identity Project is a Christian-based organization, but it has really, really great information about gender ideology and how to talk to your children about gender ideology. It's got a toolkit for parents, a toolkit for churches, and a toolkit for schools. You have some other ones on here, so please feel free There are many, many organizations like Partners for Ethical Care, Advocates Protecting Children, Our Duty, that are actively fighting this and working together to get the truth out about how harmful gender ideology is. And if you put on the last slide. So if you find yourself in our situation where your parental rights have been violated, or if you need help for your child, if your child comes to you with confusion over their sex, there is a lot more resources available that were not available when this happened with our family. So our attorney is the Child and Parental Rights Campaign, and you'll see their website there. On their website, they have this school resource guide called Navigating the Transgender Landscape. And it is a free download, but you can also order a hard copy like this one and give that to your school. It is endorsed by multiple doctors. It is very well researched, and it's a great booklet to get to your school to help them follow the law, to protect the rights of the parents, but to also do what's best for these children. And then you'll see some other support groups on there as well. And then Sex Change Regret is run by a detransitioner by the name of Walt Heyer. And there's a lot of great videos and books and resources on his website as well. And this is just scratching the surface, but these are ones that I use frequently and send out on a regular basis to people that contact me whose children have fallen prey to this ideology. But I am happy to take any questions.
Okay, questions, anyone?
I have a question. How early is this being taught in schools? How early are kids coming out and saying to their parents? At what age? What's the earliest you've heard of?
So that's a great question. And unfortunately, in states like New Jersey and California and Oregon, there's a handful of them where they have actually embedded gender ideology into their entire curriculum in K through 12. So you have to understand from a brain development standpoint, the earlier you introduce these concepts to children, the more and the quicker destabilization that takes place. Because what's happening is we are seeing this ideology create confusion where no previous confusion existed. So in other words, little Johnny or little Jane was fine with knowing their sex. There was no confusion at all. They go to school, they're read a book like I Am Jazz, or one of these books where they are taught this non-scientific nonsense of you can be a girl in a boy body, or you can be a boy in a girl body, or you could be neither. And you should pick your pronouns like you pick a pair of tennis shoes. That is when the children become very confused a lot earlier. Whereas in places like Florida, it was starting to really be in, well, there were activist teachers reading this, but it wasn't embedded in our curriculum like it was in other states. But what we were seeing, it was as embedded into our sex ed. And so there's different places where this is being snuck in, where you have to look. Another place, which I know that you guys have talked about, Robin, is SEL. That is another huge place where this ideology kind of catches a ride on the freight train and indoctrinates children that way. And so there really is no earliest. It really just depends on the state you live in, how that school's curriculum is set up. But we're definitely seeing it more and more in the sex ed. And they're using these Amaze videos that promote puberty blockers. There's even Planned Parenthood videos that promote puberty blockers, which most of these are filled with complete lies and propaganda, using words like it's a pause button, it's reversible, none of which is true. Children that go on puberty blockers, 98% of those children will go on to cross-sex hormones. This is not a pause button. That is not true. And I do want to leave you all with hope, because I know that this is really heavy, depressing stuff. It is not great news to hear that our children are being exposed to something that's really harmful and can really destabilize their identity in profound ways. But I will tell you that even kids that fall prey to this identity, parents more and more are using watchful waiting. They're going to these support groups. They're asking questions. They are not simply affirming these identities and taking their children to gender clinics. And they are finding success with getting their children to realign their identities with their sex. These children are desisting with no medicalization. And many of them, after the fact, feel shame. They feel anger, that almost like they were tricked, that they were duped into this false notion that they could change their sex or be born into the wrong body. And so the faster we can eradicate this from our schools and our society, to be honest, the better, because this is being interjected. It's really a top-down situation. You see everyone from Disney to cartoons. It's very prevalent in anime, Discord, Reddit, all those kind of social media platform that have chat rooms. I would absolutely not let my child into those. I would heavily monitor your child's social media if you will even allow that. There are so many options for phones now that I would not even be putting smartphones in any child's hand under the age of 16. But there's phones, like if you need to be able to contact your child and track your child, like where they are and all that kind of stuff, there are a lot of great options like the Gab phone, where you don't need to give them, a handheld device that has complete, unrestricted, untethered access to the internet. Because I can guarantee you, if they're not being exposed to this ideology in school or in clubs, they're being exposed through ads when they're playing a video game. They're being exposed when they're watching TV. I mean, this is literally being infused in almost every aspect of our culture. And if we as parents and a society had collectively stood up a long time ago when we saw this was happening and said, no, I'm sorry, that's not reality. This is not biological true. I think this would have ended a long time ago, but I think people didn't want to be seen as unkind. They didn't want to be, called names like transphobic or homophobic. But we have to move beyond those silly words, because children are worth fighting for. And we're talking about serious harm, long-term physical and psychological harm that is coming from this ideology and coming from these non-scientific interventions. And that's why I'm so grateful to live in Florida, because what the Florida Board of Medicine has done is they have exposed what this is. They have exposed the medical truth. And this really should have always been regulated by doctors. Doctors need to hold other doctors accountable. If there is harm occurring, then it should be on the Florida Board of Medicine or any state's Board of Medicine to be regulating those doctors and saying, no, if you're going to do this, you need to be able to demonstrate positive outcomes from this using research, not ideology.
In January, you mentioned bringing your daughter back from the precipice. Can you tell us how you did that?
So because of the lawsuit, I am fiercely protective over my child's privacy. She has absolutely been through hell. And what I can tell you is that I have spoken to other parents who have taken steps to get their children out of this. My daughter has desisted and she's on a path of self-love. But myself and these other parents, it takes some pretty radical steps depending upon how indoctrinated your child is. Removing the child from the school environment is usually step number one. Making sure the child does not have access to those trans influences. Making sure that you're monitoring and limiting the amount of time your child is spending on social media, ensuring that your child is more involved in in-person activities and making in-person friendships, not online friendships. So all of these things kind of, rebuilding your relationship with your child if that relationship is strained, or if what the school has done has created a wedge between your child and yourself. All of these things are really, really important in establishing trust with your child so that you can plant seeds of truth with your child. And just loving them, giving them healthy boundaries, allowing them some control over how they dress, how they wear their hair, but then saying no to things that are harmful, like breast binders, hormones, anything that's going to be irreversible, cause harm. The healthy boundary is no. I love you too much. You may not understand my decision, but I love you too much to allow you to do this right now before your brain is mature enough to understand. You may not agree, but we're your parents, and our number one job is to keep you safe. You're muted, Robin. I can't, sorry.
I'm looking at chat to see if anybody's got any other questions. And if not, then we'll move on to close this out. So anyone? January, I want to say it was a fantastic presentation and thank you for your time. I know you've been working relentlessly on this cause. I know we're your second event today. I know you deserve a break, a quiet night after this. But I'll keep an eye on the chat and I'll just move on to close out the event. So,
well, thank you so much for having me, Robin. I'm obviously very passionate. This has had a profound impact on our family. And I am grateful for the opportunity to just tell other parents what's happening in school so that they can protect their child from this.
Thank you so much for using your voice. This takes so much courage and dedication. All right, so the question comes up is, how does Williamson County compare to Florida and around the country when it comes to this ideology? And every parent here wants to know, is it here? And if so, how entrenched is it? And this is a graphic we presented on Monday. It's under development. I think this is about an 80 to 90% complete graphic, but there's a few things that needed to be added. And I'm not going to go into this whole thing. I spent about 30 minutes on it in Gender 101 on Monday night. But the point I want to make here with everybody, can you guys see my mouse that moves around on the screen? Well, at the top, you've got IPPF, that's International Planned Parenthood, UNESCO, United Nations, WPATH, which we've heard about tonight. Those are world international organizations pushing an ideology down, right? And then at the national level, you've got, and I'm talking about tracing it into our schools. So there's a couple of pathways that it goes to the corporations and how Nickelodeon, Disney, and Walmart and everybody is so woke. But I'm focusing on how it's getting to our children in this graphic. So at the national level, the NEA, the DOE, the CDC, and USPATH, they're all super involved in this. And then you come down to the activist organizations. And GLSEN is possibly, GLSEN and the Human Rights Campaign, you guys see it kind of on the left, closest to the school. Those are two very powerful entities that are absolutely at work. And then they feed, GLSEN feeds the GSA networks. And then down at the bottom in white, you have our local clubs. These are the local entities in Williamson County that do exist, with the exception of Rainbow Club, which is a GSA for elementary school kids. And if we permit the PRISM clubs to go forward in middle school, then I guarantee you the plan is 2 years down the road, we'll have Rainbow Clubs in our elementary school. And I'll put my word on that. I'd put money on that if the parents don't stand up now. And then that there at the bottom, you see Vanderbilt, because what does all of this stuff do? Well, it ties multiple, if there's a line on this graphic, then that organization has a no kidding link to Vanderbilt for the child to go and be physically mutilated for an ideology. So this is very sinister. And as you see that this graphic is missing some lines too, like these organizations are even more interconnected than what is currently shown. But if I connect them all, then the graphic just gets ridiculous. It's just overwhelming amount of lines. So the one line that I did include for all of them is it leads to school. It absolutely points to the school. And there's incredible amounts of money behind this, millions and billions, and people who have made it their life's work to change the next generation. So if the question is it in Williamson County schools? Yes. I mean, just by looking at this graphic and the firepower behind the ideology, it's inevitably in our schools. It may not be entrenched in the curriculum, but as January said, especially in the state of Florida, it comes in other ways. And we've seen that. So how can we help as a chapter? Because it's coming here if it's not already. And we want to be there. We want to be ready to help any parent who needs to get informed and equipped and empowered and find people to stand with them. Come to our website. So November is our focus on gender ideology. And if you look at our resource library, so just up there at the top, the next tab after home is resources, and then it'll show resource library, and this is what will come up. And as the month progresses, we are building that gender ideology toolkit, and here's what it looks like right now. It's in the very fledgling stages. It's got the live stream from Gender 101 posted, as well as the slides, and it's got the slide that I just showed you. I will update that slide as I refine it as the month goes on. In Gender Ideology Month, I'm drinking from a fire hose right along with you. I'm taking notes all the time. I took notes tonight. Every link that was mentioned by Dr. Richards in January will find its way onto this toolkit and presented in a way that makes sense. Structured out as to where the link should go. But by the end of the month, it will be an incredible resource. And if you want an example, we just finished a couple of weeks ago the social emotional learning toolkit, and that is an incredible resource for an incredibly nebulous ideology. And I appreciate January mentioning how SEL really facilitates almost any ideology they want to bring in. Just like Trisha of Parents Choice Tennessee describes SEL as the train tracks, and they send whatever they want in on that train tracks into the schools. And so gender ideology, we know the SEL, right, that Williamson County schools, we assessed Williamson County schools as an 8 to a 9 for SEL, because SEL is just so under the radar that it's easy to be that way. And if SEL is there, then you know that other ideologies are at play. So again, keep an eye out for the toolkit. We'll be building it. We'll be working on it. And if you need resources, in that same resources tab, there's a whole tab dedicated to legal resources, and reach out if you ever need help or support, or to connect with other like-minded parents. So here's our website. There's the homepage. There's our social media. If you feel inspired to help us out with continuing our efforts, then there's a QR code to help our chapter put on future events. January also mentioned CSE, Comprehensive Sex Ed, and how gender ideology is really interwoven through the CSE, especially in the state of Florida. Our focus for January, we're taking December off for the holidays, but our focus in January 2023 will be comprehensive sex ed, and we'll be putting on a 101 seminar for that and building out that toolkit. So everything kind of comes together. And that is Gender 102. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And I see there's some chats up. Any last questions? Oh, Chloe Cole's on Tucker. Okay. And thank you, Arthur. Great. thanks everybody. And we'll stop it there. Have a great night and continue the fight. Information is key. Knowledge is power. Thank you, January.